right. I don't see anything on our screens yet. There we go. Good evening and welcome to the Burnsville Parks and Natural Resources Commission for Monday, June 4th, 2012. First thing on our agenda tonight is approval of the agenda. Any changes from staff or commissioners?
Nothing from staff, Mr. Chairman.
All right, we need a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Approval of the agenda. Next item is citizen comments. This is an opportunity for someone in the audience to approach the commission on something that is not on the agenda. Seeing none, no one come forward, we'll move on. Approval of the minutes from May 7th, 2012. Any changes from staff or commissioners?
No changes from staff, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Seeing no changes recommended or suggested, well, need a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Minutes approved for May 7th, 2012. Next item is something we do every year. We have a review of our 2011 annual Deer Management Program report and proposed program strategy for 2012. The presenter is Daryl Jacobson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. As you mentioned, this is our annual report. See it every year about this time. Goes over several different areas of our deer management. A couple of them here are kind of the education, public education that's done. As part of this program, when it was started, there was a feeding ban ordinance in the city. We also have some monitoring, and then, of course, the population control piece to the program. Education, it's been pretty simple. Web page gets updated, obviously, with this plan, and then there is other information up there on for folks on kind of things they can do with keeping deer out of their yards and those type of things. And then occasionally we do also put some of that information in the Burnsville Bulletin, which gets sent out to residents. The feeding complaints, this has really been way down since the program started. It seemed like the first 3 or 4 years we got quite a few of these. Now we've had a lot of zeros, and last year we did have one complaint, which is one more than we had the previous year, but still very low. We don't get a lot of complaints in this area anymore. I think the word has kind of gotten out now that there is a feeding ban in the city. We're just recommending to continue keeping track of these, and we do send out letters to folks if they're found to be feeding and remind them of the ordinance. Monitoring, we have several different ways that we monitor the deer activity in the city. The first one is aerial counts. We go up in a helicopter and do a survey in the city. Now, this past winter, we were not able to do this. Since I've been working here, it's the first time that's happened. There is a certain amount of snow cover that's required to kind of make the survey effective, because you need that white background so that the brown deer stand out. Because when you do these counts, you're going to miss some deer no matter what. So anytime you do it, you know the number you count is the minimum amount in the city. But to justify the expense and the time to do one of those counts, you want to try to be as accurate as possible. And without sufficient snow cover, the information that you're getting isn't really comparable to past years, because we have had good snow cover. So because of that, it wasn't justifiable for the cost to go up and do a survey when it really wasn't going to provide us with the information we're looking for. And I'll go over a little bit later how we accounted for that. Obviously, we still need to come up with an estimate of how many deer are in the city, and how we did that without that information. We also collect monitoring forms that residents can fill out online, or if they call in, then we record it on a form as to what they're seeing in their neighborhood for deer movement. We also keep track of car deer crashes, and then the Burnsville Animal Control keeps track of deer carcasses that they pick up and the locations of those. there you can see one of monitoring aerial counts. Normally you'd see a number in there with the date performed. That information is not available this year. For the monitoring forms, we had five different folks. We did have some folks that called in multiple times with the same information. We just record it once. And so we had 4 general observations, which is generally people just calling in and saying, I saw X number of deer in my backyard last night. We record that with the location, and then 1 depredation report, which is when someone would call in and say, deer have been eating my shrubs in my yard or something like that. This is our monitoring information. This shows the goal for each of the units. The city's divided up into 6 different units. We have a goal set up. We have the 2011 aerial counts, and then also the 2012, normally it would say aerial count, now it says population estimate. And essentially what we did is we took the population estimate for 2011 after we did have the aerial survey, and then we subtracted the number of deer removed through the population control efforts along with car deer crashes, because we have the locations of those, subtracted those out, and then essentially performed the population model on those numbers. So we basically took what was there in 2011, subtracted what was removed, and then counted in for births and natural deaths to come up with the numbers for 2012. And we did run these numbers by the Minnesota DNR wildlife section, and they approved of these numbers and seemed that this was a solid method to use. And we do that with our numbers every year, but obviously without the aerial counts, we really wanted to make sure that they were comfortable with these numbers, and they said that they were. This is the 2011 deer survey. It's obviously we didn't have one, but this just shows kind of where we were counting deer in 2011, and is probably at least somewhat representative of what's out there in 2012. It shows that the areas with the most deer habitat are supporting the higher numbers of deer, which we would expect. Hopefully we'll get some snow this winter, and next year when I come we'll have an updated aerial survey to be able to provide with information similar to this. Crash data, there was a total of 29 deer car crashes recorded in the city. That's from the animal control folks, city, state, and county information. And that is down from last year. We have seen the car deer crashes declining in the city in the last several years. This is outlining the locations of those car deer crashes, and the different symbols are just highlighting different forms, different ways of getting the information, whether it was a city record or a state record or possibly from animal control. So we can keep track and know that each site recorded is a unique site, not one that's been recorded multiple times through the different agencies. Really, this is pretty standard. Less crashes, which is good, but you can still see that the busier roads tend to have a few more car deer crashes, especially if they're located near some deer habitat. The monitoring recommendation is just to continue what we've been doing, continue with the aerial surveys, continue taking those forms from residents and collecting that car deer crash data. Population control for the last season, we did archery hunt on public land, which was Kelleher Park. We also did sharpshooting in the northeast section of the city and the east central, which is Cliff Fen, Terrace Oaks, Black Dog Park, those areas, and the city's police department performs those tasks. You can see the goal for 2011 and 12 was 165 deer to 214. That's obviously an unrealistic number. We have 2 areas in the city, southwest and northeast, where one, we don't have a lot of control over the deer habitat in some of those areas, so it's not realistic to meet our goals. And 2, it's just a vast expanse of natural area, and so you're going to have a lot of deer there. But we have been getting those numbers down a little bit. Believe it or not, that number is smaller than it was the year before, so we're heading in the right direction. The archery program goes back to 2001. There was a citizen committee that helped develop some guidelines. The firearms ordinance was revised in 2003 to encourage archery hunting on some private property in the city. And just last year in Kelleher Park, we had 6 deer that were removed through the archery program. That was a decrease from 2010. We had good hunt hours in the park, so I don't think it was related to that. But for whatever reason, Murphy Hannerhan, which is adjacent to Kelleher Park, they also had an archery hunt and a muzzleloader hunt, and their numbers were down as well for the number of deer that were removed through their hunts. And they do those every year as well. And so can't really figure out quite what it was, but we think the deer are there. There just was not quite the hunter success rate. Could have been weather, timing, all those type of things could play a part in these hunts. This shows the goal for last year and then the number of deer actually removed from each unit. So you can see one thing I want to point out is here, the East Central unit, which is Terrace Oaks, there was 1 deer removed. When we were relaying that information to the folks that are putting this plan together, they had actually recorded that deer in the Northeast. And so we tried to get all the numbers switched around, but I noticed in the plan we did miss it in a couple of the tables. And so if you're looking at it, there should be 1 deer removed in East Central and then 1 less in Northeast. So there was 20 deer and then 1 versus what was in Table 5 of the report. The sharpshooting numbers were down this year. We had a very difficult time getting the deer into the sites to do the removals, and that was related to the lack of snow. When the deer have other opportunities for food, when there isn't snow cover on the ground, it's not frozen, those type of things, you're going to have a much harder time getting consistent activity to your bait sites, and that's what you're relying on to have a successful sharpshooting program. And we were not alone in that struggle. We checked around with several communities that perform this same work, including Three Rivers Park District and other cities in the metro, and all of them had severe decreases in their success for the sharpshooting program. And actually, I think we removed the most deer out of the different agencies that we talked to. So it was a struggle for everyone last year with that unique weather. This is outlining the recommendations for the upcoming season. So you can see that we have a program goal, which is set by 15 to 25 deer per square mile of deer habitat. We have our the adjusted counts that were in March of 2012. So that was basically taking the 2011 information and subtracting out deer that were removed. Running the population model and coming out with our November projection, which would have included, the new fawns of the year, and then coming up with our recommended removal numbers for the different units. Northeast is down to 30 deer for removal, which is the lowest it's been, I think, since we've had this plan, so that's a good sign. Southwest, that number is in about the location it has been for several years. And then the Northwest still has a large number. That's an area where there's not a lot of access for us to do deer removals. There also isn't a lot of residents up there. It's mainly industrial sites, and so we don't get complaints from that area either. So just to outline some of the reduction strategies that are being recommended. One is sharpshooting, which I mentioned. For the Northeast, East Central, and if possible, we like to get into the Northwest unit. Again, that's the area where we don't have good access. Those are the same sites that we've been doing for several years. And then the actual site specifics in those regions would be selected based on deer distribution, what we're seeing in the field. But up to this point, all of our removals have been on city property, so that's where we try to stay. And then we also have a recommendation to continue with our archery program in Kelleher Park. Southwest section of the city is not as developed as the rest, and so we do have a lot of hunting that happens on private property. And we think the archery program fits best down in that unit. We don't get a lot of complaints with the deer population down there. But this is a way, and it's very cost effective because it essentially doesn't cost us anything other than a few hours of my time to set the hunt up. So it works well. These are the proposed archery hunt dates for Kelleher Park. You'll notice the 18th and 19th, the October dates are Thursday, Friday. So that 18th is a Thursday, 19th is a Friday. So you can see that we did eliminate the Saturday hunt days for October, which was requested by the commission at a meeting in January. And then in November, we've got 2 weeks of hunting. That's Thursday through Saturday. So the 1st through the 3rd and 8th through the 10th are Thursday through Saturdays. And that second weekend would correspond with the hunt in Murphy-Hannerhan Park. And with that, I will stand for any questions that commissioners might have.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobson. Any questions from commissioners?
I have a number of questions, Mr. Chair, quite a few in fact, and so I'm wondering if maybe it wouldn't be appropriate to allow for public comment in case there is anything that would like to be said before we get started.
Usually we do that after we do discuss it, the public comments. Or?
Mr. Chairman, I think that's at your discretion.
Oh, okay. Is there anybody in the audience who wish to address this issue? Okay, Mr. Wolf.
That being satisfied, I'm happy to voice the first questions unless someone else would like to go first.
I would have a couple just to quick, so before I forget, I try to jot them down. But I'm just wondering, is it, with such a mild winter we had here, is there any evidence to think that we might have an increase in bursts this year? And so, does the proposed take increase because of that, or isn't it a factor?
The population model that we use is a standard one, averaged over many years. This is the model that they've come up with, so it's not a specific model for, say, a mild winter or a harsh winter. But certainly the winter was mild, so there could be more or a higher survival rate potentially among the young of the year. But with the model we use, it doesn't necessarily take that into account.
And you also mentioned something about encouraging citizens. Are we encouraging them on our website to call in if they see deer? You said, 3 people called in. Is that something you like to have happen, or people just aren't interested in doing it? Or
we do like to have people call in. It's obviously another tool that we have to keep track of the population because, like I mentioned, our aerial survey is a minimum amount of deer, and it's only that one day, that one time. And so getting those reports can give you a better picture over a longer period of time as to what is happening with the deer activity. I'm not sure why people aren't calling in. Either they aren't seeing deer, they're not concerned with the deer they're seeing, or maybe it is on the website. So we do have that on there for people to find, and obviously certainly many of them have over the years found that information. But getting 5 to 10 monitoring reports is probably average for a year.
okay. Anybody else? Mr. Wolf?
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you, Darrell, for the report. Maybe first of all, thank you for adjusting the dates and responding to the recommendation that we made concerning when hunting will be allowed in Kelleher Park. I appreciate that. Let me jump to the monitoring report. Seems to me that 4 reports or 4 individuals reporting is a rather meaningless statistic. And you said you're not sure why people don't report. I guess I never knew that you were looking for reports. I see deer very frequently in my area. And so I guess if that is something that we're going to use as a tool to use for estimation, we are somehow going to have to find a way to get out the word that we're interested in that. I wonder if one approach to that might not be to see if there's any interest in developing neighborhood groups that would do counts. You might even do counts on specific weekends through the year to standardize things over time, rather than having people just call in every time they see a deer. You can, I think, get better data if you do something sort of like the Christmas bird count and say every, second weekend in October, if this neighborhood is willing to count deer and provide that information, might be valuable. I don't know.
I would say that, that type of counting is not very reliable. The information that we're collecting on these monitoring forms is certainly information that supplements the aerial survey. But the way the program is written, that aerial survey really has most bearing on actual deer removals and those type of things. And it's very hard to count deer on foot. You really can't compare one time to another because, deer are aware that you're there, and if you did have a group, say, was going to count here in deer in Kelleher Park, they might walk through the whole park and nobody'd see a deer. Generally, that's not a very efficient way to count, but certainly when folks see deer in large numbers, if you see one deer, that might not be significant to the information that we're collecting. Generally, what people are reporting is, there are 10 deer in my backyard, and to me that is an excessive number and something that they want to report to the city as a concern. So it really is kind of meant for concerned citizens on the deer population. This plan's never meant to obviously eradicate deer, so to see one or two or something might not be unusual. But if you are seeing a lot of deer, or you used to see 2 deer and now you're seeing 8, that's the type of reports that we get. And I would encourage people to report those type of things.
Okay. This goes to something you said about thinking that there are deer in the southwest unit, you just didn't get as many as you expected. My observations living in that unit are that the deer count really is down. I saw far fewer deer this year than I had seen in past years, and I'm still seeing significantly fewer deer, and they're doing less damage to my hostas, which is also an indication that maybe there actually are fewer there than perhaps was anticipated. Just to clarify, I wasn't proposing that a neighborhood group would walk into the park and count. And if I would have thought a little more about it, I would have not have said on a particular day, but perhaps in a 2-week period, the number that they see coming and going to work, that walk through their yard, that kind of thing, or over even maybe a 1-month period. But again, the point being that I think if you want to use those numbers to estimate the population, you probably are going to have to find a more systematic way of collecting the observations, I would think. Not that you necessarily have to do that. I just wouldn't put much stock in what 4 people are telling me spread across the entire city.
Yeah, certainly. Yep.
Excuse me, can I just interrupt on that
You bet.
question for a minute,
Please.
Chairman?
Yes.
On the monitoring, could you just clarify for me, is there a form online that can be filled out? Okay.
Yes, there is. It's on the website.
And, okay, I'll take a look at it then, because I think that type of information, and I'll address that in my own questions later on, okay? Thank you.
Is it back to me, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Wolf.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's jump, if it's okay, to the estimated cost to implement the recommendations. I assume that these costs are generally in line with previous years,
Yes, they are.
and that what we're doing is pretty much in line with previous years. Perhaps we didn't do video production last year, but we do the statistical figures, aerial counts, et cetera, most years. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so forth. My personal take on aerial counts is that they might not be a lot more accurate than the ground counts that I was talking about. That's something that's open for for debate, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Let me ask you about the statistical figures, the $8,000 that goes into producing those. Are we having outside experts do that analysis?
Yes, we have a consulting firm that we hire to basically take the data that we provide and put it into this annual report,
Okay.
and to collect all the crash data and work with the DNR on getting the numbers. So that is where that number
Okay, so not only do they do the calculation, but they also compile, they also go out and pull the data together?
Yes.
That isn't something that staff does?
No.
Okay. Because I was wondering, I assume that that projection is based on some sort of multi-regression analysis, and I'm wondering if it would make sense to consider asking them to produce the model and putting the numbers into it ourselves, so that we pay an upfront cost for the model and then don't pay the $8,000 or some portion of that every year to have them actually run the calculations. Because once you have the regression model, it should be pretty easy to just plug in the variables and generate the estimate. And so I'm bringing that up for discussion, consideration. I don't know of the 8,000, what percentage of that is time spent collecting the figures that we would be paying for anyway, but I'd be curious to know a little bit more about that figure.
Mr. Chair, may I make a comment about that?
Yes.
I think in light of the budget constraints on the Park and Natural Resources staff, I would be against of giving them any more work to do than they are doing now. I think in terms of the dollars, it'd be nice if we could do that, but I think at this point I would be not for putting more work on the staff, which are really overburdened, doing more than their share right now. So I disagree with you on that point.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Wolf and Commissioner Nachman is exactly on target with his comment. I mean, one of the reasons we use consultants is the limit that we have in terms of staff time available to do these sorts of things. We have taken on the baiting part of the program. As of Mr. Jacobson's 2 years ago, we switched to police sharpshooters, so we are literally doing the baiting now. That used to be done by a contractor, and so we've taken on that. And so really we need to use consultants to supplement our staff time. I will let Daryl address probably running the model. The model is one that the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources came up with and utilizes, and my guess is they would provide it to us for free, but putting the data into that once it's been accumulated is probably a fairly simple and short task. It's probably a very small part of the cost that you see for generating the report.
May I reply, Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Wolf.
My goal is not to burden the staff, but it seems to me that anytime you can cut costs, it only ends up producing potentially more funds to pay staff. So anything that looks to me to be costing the city more money than it needs to be paying, it seems to me ought to be looked at. And if it means that staff has to do more work, but we save money, which can provide for more staff, we're still coming out ahead. So I don't want to get bogged down on this one item particularly, and I would certainly be flexible and don't want to suggest that this has to be done in-house. I'd just like to know where the costs are. If $7,000 of that is paying to have a statistician plug in numbers to an equation in a spreadsheet, then I think, it would make sense to have someone else put in those numbers. And generally, once you've created the model, that is what you're doing. But again, I'm willing to hear much more about how that figure actually breaks out and what's being done. You mentioned that when conditions are not favorable, you don't get as many animals in the sharpshooting. So again, looking at costs, maybe sharpshooting should only be done when conditions are X, Y, or Z and not done at all if they're not. And finally, let me share a thought I had out loud, not necessarily making a proposal, but white-tailed deer are not an endangered species. If we are off on our estimates and we harvest more than we perhaps would have desired, we don't endanger an endangered species, and we don't endanger the public. In fact, if we take more deer than what we might consider optimal, we probably reduce collisions, etc. And where I'm going with that is that, I'd be inclined to take as many deer as I could, given the constraints upon us. In other words, there are only so many days that we can be allowed to hunt in the parks, etc. So there are limits to what we can do. But I would be taking as many deer as possible and monitoring over time to see sort of where we're at, rather than spending all of this time setting targets. And maybe do the counting and the statistical analysis on like a 3-year cycle. So you'd go through and just get as many of the deer as you possibly can for 3 years, 2 or 3 years, then look at your numbers, do the same thing again, look at your numbers. The one exception would probably be the complaints, maybe the collisions. You could look at those every year and see if there's an obvious trend, an obvious jump. But I don't see the need to carefully calculate this out. Just get as many as you can. And if they go down lower than what has sort of been the given estimate, you can ease up and let them come back up a little bit again. And I think they're actually, if you look to protect biodiversity and promote biodiversity, that might be a better way to go. Because fluctuating populations tend to allow for greater diversity of plants in particular than do constant populations. Because constant populations, the more you hold them constant, the more those species that the deer prefer, if the population is a little high, the more they're lost. And those that are left alone, the better they do. And if you fluctuate that, you can allow different competing species to take hold. So those are my thoughts, open to discussion, obviously. Again, it's not my desire to dictate how this should be done, only to pay attention to the figures. I think wherever this commission is faced with expenditures, we ought to study them carefully and make sure that we're being as cost effective as we can possibly be. So, those are my questions, my comments. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Wolf. Any other follow-up to that? Yes.
Well, I'll try to answer or respond at least a little bit to, certainly with the sharpshooting, in talking about different, doing it when it's effective and when, not doing it when it's not effective. I completely agree. We just started our program of doing it in-house 2 years ago, so we're learning a little bit as we go. We did hire a professional to come in and train with the baiting. That's the part that you really need to figure out, is the animal behavior piece of it. Obviously, the police handle the other side of it. And I think if we had another winter like this one, we probably would approach it a little bit differently. But these type of winters don't come along very often, so I'm guessing that we will have, hopefully we'll have favorable conditions, and we'll have a climate that we're used to, where there is snow and some cold weather in winter. I think most Minnesotans probably expect that, but I would agree, if there is other circumstances, we wouldn't go out, and certainly doing this in-house hopefully will save us money over the long term versus the contractor we used to have.
Mr. Jacobson, could you address, we're not going to harvest 178 deer, which is our goal. On any given year, I don't think we've hit that number. So I would say to you, Commissioner Wolf, is that we are maximizing those opportunities. We're targeting those removals in the areas where we have the highest counts. But I don't see any way that we're going to get 178 deer, even with our very best efforts and our very best year of harvesting.
That's correct. I mean, the sharpshooting, the dollar figure in there is to pay for the police officers' time when they're out. You know, they're doing this outside of their normal duties, and so they're being paid to do that. And so there isn't even enough money in this budget to potentially remove that many deer because the amount of man hours required would far exceed this number. So,
Mr. Chair, may I respond?
Yes, Commissioner Wolf.
If that's true, Mr. Schultz, then it makes no sense to be collecting this data to set the number that we're going to take. If we never take that number, then let's just take all we can every time. Why spend $10,000 a year calculating a number and producing a projection of how many we would like to take when we never can take that many? Just take as many as you can. It doesn't mean you have to take them all. My point was that if somehow you took more than you might have wanted to, if you had accurate projections, you haven't endangered a species. You haven't done anything that is going to be causing damage that cannot be corrected. So the argument that we never take that many deer is just simply an argument not to collect all those statistics and spend that $10,000 every year.
well, the way the city's managed is there's 6 different management units. So when you look at the large number as a whole, we never would remove the entire number recommended for the whole city, but we do have units where those numbers are more realistic to achieve that goal, such as East Central, Northeast this year is 30 deer. That's a realistic goal. And so because of the way the plan is set up and the fact that we're managing the city in different sections as opposed to just the city, then you do have those numbers that you would potentially remove too many deer versus what is set in the plan for those units.
Would you be willing to define for me what is too many deer?
According
Removing
to the
too many
plan,
deer.
a deer population below 15 deer per square mile is too low.
Can you tell me how that number was calculated? Why is a deer density below that too low? When you say too low, I assume that some social benefit is lost at that density, some important social benefit, something significant enough to justify the cost. So what is that social benefit?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Wolf, I would say to you that when this plan was put in place in 2001, it was a fairly controversial plan. And the fears of many people were that we would eliminate deer in any given part of the community. And so the benefit to them was being able to see deer when they were in the parks. For some, it was in their yards. Some would have us remove none. And there was also a lot of concern about was staff just guessing at how many deer should be removed. So just a little bit of the history. Commissioner Wolf, you weren't there in 2001. I was there. I can tell you it was quite controversial. And those were the concerns. And so that's why the counts, we decided we're going to take counts every year. Again, there was great concern. You're going to eliminate all the deer in my neighborhood. I'm never going to have the advantage of seeing deer in my neighborhood. In terms of the ecosystem, I think I would agree with you that probably 15 deer per square mile is too high for some of the plant communities. But
If maintained there for a long period of
yeah.
time.
So I would say to you that population density was a bit of a compromise. It also happened to fall in line with what the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources was using at that time, and I believe is still using at this time. Now, they may have exceptions, again, in some of their areas where they're trying to restore a plant community. They may drop that down below that. We have that flexibility also, and you'll notice we do that in I think it's one of our management units currently. So I would just say to you, Commissioner Wolf, there's some history and some strong feelings in the community, at least when the plan was put in place. Now, does that mean that's where we should still be going? That's why we bring this to you every year for you to react to. But I want you to understand kind of the background behind the strategies.
Mr. Chair, may I?
Yes, Commissioner Wolf.
Proceed further? Thank you. I wasn't here, and I don't have the history that you have. Obviously, this is an issue, however, that most suburbs face, and not just in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, but across the nation. So I'm aware of the fact that it can get hot, and that's a very political issue that is well known to conservation biologists. I think that often one of the concerns that is generated is the concern over pain and suffering. Is that true? It's not just that people come in and are worried that you'll eliminate all the deer from their backyard and they won't see them anymore. My experience when these kind of debates come up is that the more vociferous group is the group that says, you can't do this harm. They have a right to exist and so forth. Is that a reasonable, that at least that's a high percentage?
I would agree with that statement.
And it might be that the approach that brings the deer population down slower absolutely minimizes the amount of pain and suffering that the deer experience. Because a population that is at 1/2 carrying capacity, if you assume a basic logistic model, is the population that's growing the fastest, which means it's the population that requires the most culling to keep it at that level. If you take the population down, it grows slower, requires less culling. Actually, there's less, there are fewer animals that need to be sacrificed. I guess where I'm going with that is that if we wanted to reconsider some of this, I would be happy to, you probably wouldn't, but I'd be happy to return and reevaluate it and let the public have their say, and to do my best to persuade them that what I'm suggesting is not inhumane or violating any sound game management.
Mr. Chair, just to make a comment.
Yes, Mr. Nachman.
Having been at several of those meetings, the emotions get very high, which is more important, a wild fern or a deer. And it's, maybe to have a public hearing is a good way to attract a big audience for our park and natural resources. I think over the past years, and I live in an area that is fighting about deer every minute, which is East Central. And, I think it's up and down. The population varies. And on Monday, people are unhappy because they ate the petunias. But on Tuesday, Grandpa has her grandchildren over and look at all the deer. How much fun is that? And I just, before we do that, I'd just like to make a comment about the emotion that is involved in that particular activity. So maybe with you meeting with Daryl or Terry or some of the folks from the staff, and maybe come up with some suggestions. I think you probably have sufficient background to do that, and bring it to them and let them take a look, and maybe at some point bring it back to us with some alternatives so we don't have to go back and forth about the deer versus the plants versus all the other emotional stuff. So just a comment. But I'm not saying we need to stop and not do anything.
Mr. Chair, if I'm not abusing my privilege, am I allowed to respond? Or would you mind if I...
Thank you, Mr. Nachman. Yes, go ahead, Mr. Commissioner Wolf.
It's tempting to avoid controversial and heated issues. Unfortunately, I think when government does that, they do a disservice to the public. I think we have an obligation to address such issues and to address them in a public forum where people have the right to speak out. And I think we often complain about our government and often complain that our government makes decisions that we are not given the opportunity to fairly discuss and debate and comment on. I don't want to hide from controversy, and I don't want to hide from the heat. I know it can get hot. I've been sworn at many times in many settings by people pro-trapping, anti-trapping, pro-hunting, anti-hunting. But that's part of it. If I'm going to sit on this commission, I'm willing to accept that. The other thing I would say is that probably none of us wants to put ourselves through it, but it's an opportunity to educate. And I don't think that we should necessarily walk away from that as well. The better the public understands these issues, the better the sport will have in the long run, in my opinion. So again, I think the educational component is reason not to dodge this issue as well. And I seem to be, I probably appear to be a little feisty tonight. I think with that, I will I will take a break, and we can move on unless others would like to comment.
Mr. Chairman, I have a couple questions.
Yes, Mr. Lindsay?
First of all, can you clarify for me the approach you take on this aerial count? What is included in it and what's not included in it?
Well, essentially
Where you fly over, I guess. That's what.
yes.
Okay.
We fly over the entire city with the exception of the Burnsville Center kind of location around there with all the impervious pavement and stuff that's in there. We find that it's not, and we actually did fly over that area in the first couple years of the survey, but as we did that, we never count any deer there, and obviously you're paying for that time. Believe it or not, we have counted deer at one time or another in most other areas of the city, at least neighborhoods and things like that. And so we try to cover as much as we can within reason, not covering those areas where you're probably not going to count any deer. And we do have a pattern that we've used for several years. It was started by the DNR. They initially did our surveys for us for the first couple years, but then because of their budget cuts and issues, they were no longer able to do that. So essentially, you fly over an area one time, count the deer that you see, then you turn around, take about a quarter mile or so jump, sometimes a little less, and you fly it back. So you just fly basically a pattern across, and you're counting the deer that you see, and you're marking their locations with the GPS unit in the helicopter. So then at the end, you can take that information, put it on a map like you saw with the location, and then a number inside it, so you know if there was one deer there or five or what we saw.
Getting back to the question that Mr. Wolf had on the monitoring form, I am not familiar really with the one on the website. Could you tell me really what that includes? What are the questions, or what it has to be filled out on it? Do you know?
Yes. The top portion is essentially name, phone number, email, address, that type of stuff. And then underneath that, there is some categories like you saw earlier in the slides: general observation, depredation, and so then you can pick what type of activity you're reporting. And then underneath that, there's a spot for comments or remarks. And so you get to write in essentially what your specific concern or what you're essentially reporting about. So most people, what an average one would look like is, their contact information, the location, and then it might say general observation, saw 8 deer sleeping in my backyard yesterday afternoon.
Being I haven't seen it, so 8 is not is just to fill in under description. It's not like a blank. How many deer did you see? And you put 8, 6, 5, 4. It's not just
No.
okay. It doesn't give you any indication of the size or the maturity of the deer or anything of that sort.
If they write it in, a lot of folks do.
But it's just not a.
It's not a specific
So you really
checkbox.
can't sort on it. It's not
No.
really sortable.
No, just by the initial checkbox is that there's about 4 of them. From that's the only.
Okay. Couple other questions. First of all, I mean, in our area, in my area, which was like East Central, would that be where my neighbor go here? I mean, there's been a substantial number of increase in deer. Okay, and I didn't know about this report. I would report on it, but on the other hand, if I report more than once, it appears that you don't count it anyways, even though I see deer more than once. And actually, even during this, if I understood you, I mean, you record it, but it's not unique.
If your report changes, we do record it. We have several folks who will report essentially the same item multiple times.
Well, I think it's important, in my observation of the deer, is that I may see them on multiple days, and I think that's important because they are traveling through the area, say from Red Oak to Terrace Oaks, okay, and small herd at times. And so I think that observation would be important if I knew it was going to be captured to use to some value. Now, if it's not going to be used for any value, as I do have some question about, because the numbers are down and it appears that the aerial is your most keyed item from that standpoint. So my observations, even for today, that seem to be watered down, yet it's I have found that I enjoy looking at the deer, but I also am not so happy about replacing all my plants every year, okay, as the population has increased. And I think probably others have seen that as well at times, okay. So I like the idea of monitoring and having on-the-ground observations and have a model that actually could use that and have fields that could be filled in that actually use that type of information. Now, we know the accuracy between be it a buck or a doe could be questionable, but it could have some idea about the size and when they're moving through. And I think that would be, I mean, you could bring sharpshooters in the back of my yard and get 9, okay? I mean, and yet I don't think you have that 9 in my whole area. But they are traveling between Red Oak and Terrace Oaks, okay? Now, and also the fact is there is another aspect to that. As nice as those deer are, I can't enjoy the birds because I can't feed them. Because the deer get the bird feed. So there is another offset that does happen to the wildlife population, that you cannot enjoy another segment of it because of the deer population. And I do have to agree with Mr. Wolf that I would like, I would have to say that his comment about trying to get as many deer as possible in a given year and bring that population down would get my support on that. I think that our counts are probably low. I don't think our monitoring really is picking up the number of deer, and I think and they're going to, and since they're not on the endangered species from that standpoint, as much as I enjoy viewing them and photographing them, I also recognize the detriment that they provide even to my area. Okay, so I just want to make that comment. And if what is we spent what, $38,000, and how many deer did we take last year?
Well, we didn't spend all 38,000 last year because the sharpshooting wasn't as successful, so we didn't go out as often.
What did we spend last year?
Last year we probably spent, obviously I don't have the information here tonight, probably somewhere between 15 and 20,000.
And how many deer did we take?
It's in here. 21 with sharpshooting and 9 with archery and muzzleloader hunt at Murphy Hanrahan.
So we got about 30 deer, 29 deer,
Yes,
29
31, yeah,
deer,
31
at
deer.
15,000.
Yep.
$500 a deer. Did that come out?
Yes.
Okay, so and based on what was Mr. Wolf, I see the system is perpetuating itself. It's always going to be X amount of dollars, and the counts are always going to be trying to stay within that goal. And I'm not sure why 15 deer. First of all, the population of Burnsville has increased, as far as I know. The density seems to sure have increased, and yet we're using 2001 numbers or concerns about how we put this together. So I would just suggest, or I look at it and say, I think it's probably time to reassess our monitoring policy. That's the comments that I have. $500 a deer, and with expenses going up. I mean, if you really were to take your goal in mind and why you can't reach that goal, you don't have a budget to take out the number of deer we have, unless we have a very aggressive plan of saying, hey, look, let's put the money that we have and let's take out as many deer as we can and bring it down for maybe a 3-year plan and then monitor from that standpoint. That would be my thoughts, and based on what Mr. Wolf said. So, Mr. Chair, that's the end of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Denzi. Yes.
I just wanted to respond quickly. There's a lot of things covered there, but a couple of them. Last year was around $500 a deer. Obviously, last year was not a good year for deer removal, so that's a high number. Certainly, when you have more efficient seasons, essentially you're paying these sharpshooters by the hour that they're out. So the more deer they're removing, that cost goes down because you're getting more deer for the amount of time that they're out. And last year was the worst season we've had since I've been here. So certainly we expect that number will be lower in most years, if not all. And then to the, we actually do have some flexibility. I think it was maybe 2 years ago we brought an item where in certain areas where there is forest management going on, we can take the deer population down to 5 deer per square mile. So right now we have that with Terrace Oaks and Kelleher Park, where we have a large restoration going on with DNR grant money. So the plan does allow for that if there's another activity involved that would warrant a temporary reduction. It does call for temporary reduction through that restoration process. So I just wanted to remind commissioners of that it's not necessarily that there is no alternative to the number that's in the plan, but there is some caveats that go with the ability to lower that number down to 5 deer per square mile.
And one more comment off of that, and I just want to add about Mr. Chair, can I?
Yes, Mr.
Is that even in my yard, and I have to say this, the deer are great to look at, but however, come spring, there's 2 fawns, and the mother they were twins, they were in the backyard. Mother was just skin and bones. So I don't think we're doing necessarily that all the time. You do not have that picturesque view of the deer in that warm. It definitely indicated that there was insufficient food at this point. This deer could not. Okay, so we really probably weren't doing all 3 of them much of a favor by trying to maintain what our goals here seem to be. So I just want to say that there, at least in my general area, there surely seems to be a high increase of deer population, and I've seen that now in the past 4 years, where before I would only see 1 or 2. Now they're coming in maybe 4 minimum at a time and up to 9. So and if I've seen that, I think other people must be viewing that, but they're not reporting it. And I think we have to look at a more aggressive reporting system. We have to look at something to let people know they can report it and to monitor, and it's going to be used for something from that standpoint, that it's not only necessary aerial, that the deer are moving every day, not just 1 day out of the month. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I got on tangent there. I'm done.
Okay, Commissioner Nachman. Mr. Denzin, I'm sorry. Yes, Terry.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, if I can just add a couple of comments, and Mr. Jacobson helped me out. I think it's safe to say if we took all the money that we have in our program budget, so if we didn't do any monitoring and we freed up that $8,000 this year to put towards sharpshooting, we would still not have enough money in the budget to hit that target of 178 deer. And I understand the desire to do that. So I would say to you, it's a bit of a moot point for now in that we are removing as many deer as we can with the budget constraints we have. Now, if where you're going is you want to recommend that council put more money into it for a few years, get those numbers down quickly, I understand that, and that might be a recommendation you'd want to make. I can just add to I don't think anybody's trying to dodge an issue or avoid controversy. That certainly wasn't the intent of my comments. I just wanted to explain that there's a point of view out there, and really the numbers in the program that was arrived at was a compromise back at that time, because people do put a value on the social aspect of seeing deer in their community. And then I promised to stop after this, but the flip side of taking too many deer out of a management unit is not taking any deer when you should be. And so if you don't count deer for a 3 or 4 year period, we are going to get complaints because we're not going to be working in areas where we have counts that say there's 0 deer there. And so then we're not going to be doing removals in those areas, and people, I think, are going to be concerned that we're not keeping our counts current now. I also agree perhaps we wouldn't have to do this every year. That's certainly a viable recommendation if the reporting's too frequent. But you'd want to be careful about putting those gaps too far apart from when you get the counts. And finally, I would say that the aerial counts are by far our our most important indicator of how many deer we're taking out. They are our primary indicator, and the monitoring reports, Mr. Jakesman really kind of helps us focus in on specifically within that management unit, where are those deer? When you're taking counts over a number of days, you perhaps are counting the same deer over and over again. When you do a flyover in a matter of a 4-hour period, you have fairly good confidence that you're only counting the deer once. That's not 100%. With that, I will be quiet.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz.
Chair, may I respond, since some of those comments seem to have been relevant or responsive to what I had previously
Yes,
said?
Mr. Wolf?
First, let me make it clear that I was not accusing any commissioner or staff member of trying to avoid debate. I was simply making it clear where I stand and making it clear that I think we should not, period. Didn't mean to impugn anybody's motives here whatsoever. I appreciate your response, Terry, but I don't think, perhaps I wasn't clear enough about the 3-year cycle thing. My point is that you seem to me, I shouldn't say you, the city seems to be collecting data that we're really not using. Everybody agrees that we probably want to take the herd down further than we are. We're typically not meeting our marks. So no matter what our figures would have said, we probably didn't need them, didn't use them. That's my view of it. So I don't know why we wouldn't maybe want to collect them every 3rd year or 4th year and save that money. And you could, for example, shift that money that you're doing to do the counts. If you did a count every 3 or 4 years, you could shift that money into sharpshooting and double up your sharpshooting once every 3 or 4 years, and perhaps bring the population down further. So I guess those 2 comments, and then one other response is, if you look at the numbers actually collected, I thought they were kind of interesting. Look at the aerial counts. I'm looking for the table. Here it is, page 5. The table, you have your aerial counts. If you look at your highest aerial counts, they were in 2010, it's number 1. 2008 was number 2. 2011 was number 3. 2012 was number 4. Now look at number of crashes. Number 1 is 2003, 2 is 2004, 3 is 2005. They don't line up very well. 4 is 2007. Look at your depredation complaints, and number 1 is 2003, number 2 is 2004, number 3 is 2008. There's better agreement between the crashes and the depredation complaints than there is between the aerial counts and either of the other 2. Is that meaningful? Without crunching numbers and getting more data, I don't think I can say that, but on the face of it, I'd call it prima facie evidence that I might be justified in questioning the value of the aerial counts. Oh, one other item, if I may. It's not, if you had neighborhood counts, you might count deer twice. But what you're doing is using the count as an indice. You're not saying that you're going to add up all the deer counted and make that your estimate. What you assume is that whether you're counting them once or twice, the more you count, the higher the population. And so what you find is some function, some equation that relates the number that you count to an estimate of the population. So I don't think it's a problem that you might be counting deer, the same deer more than once when you're doing ground counts. As long as there's a relationship, a correlation between the number you're counting and the density, you can use those as an indices to estimate the density. Thank you again, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Wolf, for your comments. Daryl or Terry? Anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, I mean, that's why we bring this report to you, and if you would like to recommend some changes, I think Commissioner Wolf's idea, perhaps we can cut back on how frequently we do the aerials counts and these reports, and put that money towards sharpshooting. That's certainly worth looking at. One of the things you could do is forward a recommendation to City Council that we look at those things for the upcoming year. You could adopt this report and note to staff that you want to maybe look at this a little bit closer. We have, I believe, obviously initially in 2001, we put this monitoring, this plan in place and the strategies, but I think in the last 4 years, Daryl, you may not have been involved, but we did look at counting strategies for counting deer. Are there other options out there that are more viable? We did evaluate that about 4 years ago. Things change over time. We still landed on the same doing aerial counts. So there's a couple of options that you have before you, Commissioners. I think we are probably all in agreement, if I'm hearing things correctly, that we need to remove as many deer we obviously have more deer than we're possibly going to remove this year. And at least perhaps we can move forward that, and then if you wanted to look into some of these other issues as we go into the summer and fall, that might be an option for you if you'd like to talk about this at a work session.
That was good. The words are out of my mouth. It's something we want to look at as a work session in the near future, and we can debate it more thoroughly then.
Also move that we do that.
Yep. So what that means, that points in, we're not going. Our recommendation will be at this point to schedule a work session to review any possible future changes in the plan.
Yeah, Commissioners, my recommendation, maybe you consider a motion that would accept this report. I don't think the report's in doubt. And then I think the strategies that staff has recommended going into this hunt season, you're okay with. What's in question is how frequently we do the counts, which is really a 2013 budget item. So we have some time to work on that. So you could recommend or accept the report, recommend approval of the deer program strategies in terms of the harvest for 2012-2013, and then include that you would like to take a look at the reporting mechanism part of this report at a work session this year.
Rather than simply repeat Mr. Schultz, I will move that we follow his advice and that we look in particular at, I want to make sure that this is understood, that we will look at the procedures for producing our estimates at a work session.
So the motion would be we're going to approve the report as submitted, and then look into a work session to look at how we're counting in the future.
Approve the plan
Approve the plan,
and
and then
schedule a work session.
I'm not sure who made the motion anymore.
Commissioner Wolf, I believe, made the
Okay,
motion, and
okay.
we are.
I will second that. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Nay.
We have one nay. Any comments you wish to add to that?
I'll save it for the work session.
Okay.
I'll vote nay on that too.
Okay, we got 2 nays. All right, next one. Is consider a recommendation regarding proposed, more on deer hunting, it looks like, proposed changes to the firearms ordinance that would establish a permit system to allow for bow hunting on private property adjacent to city parks with certain restrictions. And Daryl, you are the lucky chosen one for this one as well.
I'm back. Yes, we brought this, or I should say staff brought this to a work session in January to the commission. And at that time, we did have some residents that showed up. We were running into an issue where some folks in the city were getting confused about how the ordinance was worded and how it pertained to city land essentially, and what it meant for them as to where they could hunt on their own private property. And at that time, we did get some information from the commission that they'd be interested in having the city attorney take a look at rewording this ordinance, coming up with the possibility for those folks to do some hunting near or adjacent to the city parks with some type of a permit program, but only during the time when the park is closed for an ongoing special hunt. And so included in your packet was the updated language. Essentially, the language that is underlined has been added to the existing ordinance by the city attorney. And I think with this wording, it achieves the goals that were kind of set forth as to, establishing a way for folks to get a permit from the city, and during what times that they could get those permits to kind of supplement the hunting. As you noticed in the last piece we brought up, we did amend the ordinance in 2003 to encourage more private hunting in the city. Obviously, that's a good way to get the population down at no cost to the city. And this is kind of taking that a step further and possibly opening up a few more opportunities, we think, in a safe way. With that, I don't know if commissioners have any questions. I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Was this the time when a citizen approached the commission and talked about, okay. I know we had quite a discussion on that. Any comments from commissioners?
I think the language looks fine.
Okay. Seeing no comments, we need a motion on this, is that right, Terry?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if the commission would consider a motion, a recommendation to City Council on the ordinance change.
Okay, we need a motion for that then?
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to
Okay,
approve.
and we need a second?
Second.
Okay, all approved, all in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That one carries. Last item, miscellaneous. Any miscellaneous items from staff or commissioners?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, in lieu of our July meeting, staff is proposing, first off, we will have a commissioner training session for those who can attend on Monday, June 25th from 6 to 7 p.m. Both returning commissioners and new commissioners, I think, would gain from being a part of that training. And if you could let me know if you're able to attend by June 19th, we will be providing some dinner since it's over the dinner hour. So June 25th, 6 to 7 p.m. You can talk to me after the meeting or shoot me an email.
Where's that at, Terry?
That'll be right here at City Hall in the council chambers. Having said that, we would not then have a July meeting unless an item comes up that we need to meet on. But the intention right now is that this training session would replace our July meeting. I do want to thank Commissioners Adrian and Robalee for their year. This is their last meeting, and I want to thank you for your time and serving on the commission. And I will just end with the next formal PNRC meeting then would be August 20th at 6:30 p.m. It's a little later in the month than we would normally meet because of Night to Unite being held at the first part of the month.
Is that different from the
6 p.m.?
night or the neighborhood?
That's
Neighborhood.
the new name for National Night Out.
National, yeah, that's what I was trying to.
Was that 6 or 6:30?
I'm sorry, the meeting in August will be at our normal time, which is 6:30. The commissioner training on June 25th is a 6 p.m. start.
Okay. All right, that sounds good. Last item, I need a motion to adjourn.
I had a couple things.
Excuse me?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, Mr. Schultz, just a couple of things with awareness. An invasive species was discovered. They're looking at it up on, I believe it's Highway 95 in the Stillwater area. It's Asian bittersweet, and it's kind of a woody species that grows like a vine, but it has a choking impact on a lot of other species. It tends to be found along fence lines in area, but it grows quite tall. We found, they brought in a sample today, it's about 15 years old, and has kind of a strangling effect. But it's mainly been found down in southeast Minnesota, and it was kind of an interesting discovery. It's been there for a long time, but somebody just kind of discovered it. So there's going to be a lot of research on that in controlling that type of invasive species. But just for your awareness, Google it sometimes, called Asian bittersweet. Look, and if you are out on walks or something and you happen to identify a plant or you think similar to that, it would be interesting to note that and to have some awareness around it where those plants are at. Obviously, it's probably scattered more than we think. And the other is just awareness that the CWD was found in the metro area in a private farm up in the North Oaks suburb, and there'll be some interesting research out of that because it was a very well managed site. And so the data coming out of that and the research coming out of that should be beneficial to all suburbs in the future as this aware.
CWD is cervid wasting disease?
Yes. That's all.
Okay, thank you. All right, with that, any other comments, questions? We need a motion to adjourn then? I'll make that motion to adjourn.
Second.
Second, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion, meeting adjourned. Thank you and good night.